Wing Bashir has funded a terrorist training camp in Aceh and helped to buy weapons used to commit acts of terror. Footage has emerged of the camp in Aceh, where armed fighters can be seen undergoing military training. In a statement, they call themselves Al-Qaeda Indonesia. More than 130 members of the group were arrested after police raided the camp in 2010. Those who escaped were allegedly involved in bank robberies and an attack on a police station that killed several policemen. Prosecutors say they now have evidence the group was planning Mumbai-style attacks, allegedly targeting embassies, hotels and the presidential palace. Bashir is the founder of an Islamic boarding school in central Java that has educated several people convicted for terrorism in the past. The cleric has a small but dedicated group of followers. He spent 2 years in prison in connection with the Bali attacks in 2002, but was never proven to be the leader of Jemaah Islamiyah, the network held responsible for the bombings. In 2004 he was jailed again, but got an early release in 2006. Abu Bakr Bashir has kept silent so far, but he did write a letter obtained by Al Jazeera in which he uses several verses from the Quran to endorse the armed training camp in Aceh. But if this letter and the testimony of 134 witnesses will be enough to jail him for terrorism is still a serious challenge for the prosecution. Step Fasten, Al Jazeera, Jakarta.
This is Al Jazeera. Adrian Finnegan with you here in Doha. The top stories this hour. Anti-government protests are continuing in Egypt, with workers now going on strike. They're unhappy at pay and conditions. A group of so-called wise men is currently negotiating about a transfer of power within the government to try to solve the deadlock. But within the past couple of hours, the White House has criticized Egypt's Vice President Omar Suleiman's plans for the country.
The process for his transition does not appear to be in line with the people of Egypt. And I think we believe that more has to be done, and I think, more importantly, the people of Egypt think more have to be done. I think that's why you continue to see the size of those gathered to express their concerns about their lack of recognition in freedom and opportunity, why those ranks continue to grow.
One other item of news from the Middle East. The King of Jordan has sworn in a new government. Maruf Bakit, an ex-army general, becomes prime minister. He's been tasked with carrying out political reforms. King Abdullah shook up his cabinet last week after protests inspired by the demonstrations in Egypt and Tunisia called for change in Jordan. Prosecutors in Italy have called for Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi to go on trial now for abuse of power and child prostitution. He denies allegations of paying for sex with a number of young women, including a 17-year-old Moroccan dancer. Military talks between South and North Korea have collapsed. South Korea's defense ministry says that the North walked out of the negotiations. They were the first between the two sides since the shelling of a South Korean island in November. At least 4 Russian sailors are dead, 7 are missing after a Cambodian cargo ship sank. Coast Guards think that the vessel, called the Alexandra, collided with an as-yet unidentified ship. It happened some 25 kilometers off the coast of South Korea. The boss of Nokia has compared the firm to a man standing on a burning oil platform surrounded by a blazing fire of competition. Stephen Elop wrote the words in an internal staff memo, which was then leaked, and tells them that big decisions need to be made. 3 years ago, Nokia had a 40% market share, but it's been sliding since and faces stiff competition. Those are the headlines. Now here's Empire.
A desperate act became a rallying cause.
I am here to fight for my freedom and for my country.
Social networks pursuing social justice, organizing countrywide demonstrations, igniting national uprisings, triggering revolutions. As the Egyptian regime implodes,
I will die on Egyptian soil.
We ask, who and what's next in the Arab world?
This
is empire. Hello and welcome to Empire. I am Marwan Bishara. The Arabs' time have finally come. The lie has been exposed. Change is within reach. Forced to choose between despotic regimes and foreign interventions, between oppressive stagnation and the threat of religious tyranny, the Arabs in Tunisia, Egypt, and elsewhere have chosen freedom. Freedom of expression, freedom from want, freedom from false choices. Never has personal and national dignity been so intertwined, so mutually reinforcing, so inspiring. Never has a national transformation come so suddenly, the stakes been so high, people so daring. Across the Arab world, the message on the street is loud and clear. People want their long-standing autocratic governments to go now. From Tunisia to Algeria to Jordan, Yemen and Egypt.
I have asked the government to resign and I will appoint a new one starting tomorrow.
The trigger for all this? One man, Mohammed Bouazizi, a jobless university graduate. He set himself on fire to protest conditions that many Arab youth find themselves in. Unemployment, poverty, lack of opportunity. And where Bouazizi left off, social media and satellite television picked up.
A very large segment of the population is under the age of 25. These are people who are often unemployed, have very limited prospects for good jobs and a good life, are politically also, in a sense, castrated because of the authoritarian practices of the regime.
The 1980s saw a wave of popular unrest reshape the world. The Iron Curtain was torn down, and one by one, the dominoes of Eastern Europe fell. In Latin America, autocratic strongmen were swept away by democratic forces, but not in the Arab world, where dictators have been around for decades. The strongmen have ruled using Israel as a pretext, rallying national sentiment to gain legitimacy, and then invoking emergency powers to counter the threat of the Zionist aggression. But why do autocrats proliferate in the Arab world?
There's an argument that Islam is antithetical to democracy and democratic practices and institutions. There's another theory that says that oil wealth prevents democracy from emerging because the state is much too powerful and much too wealthy to make any concessions to the people.
The West says it supports regime change as a result of popular uprising, and yet backs dictators who do their bidding. But in the Arab world, there is another paradigm.
There's the fear that Islamists would come to power and that Islamists would be against the West.
So what's different about this wave of protests?
There are much more people involved. The mass basis of these protests is much wider, first and foremost. Secondly, the level of violence so far has been wider. Hopefully we're not there, but we could well be at the brink of civil war.
The West's reaction to the current demand for more democracy in the Arab world has been lukewarm at best and slow to come.
An orderly transition must begin now.
In spite of that, Arab leaders are reacting and talking reform. Jordan's King Abdullah has sacked his entire government, and Yemeni President Ali Abdullah Saleh announced that he would quit at the end of his term in 2013.
There's no extension, no inheritance, no resetting the clock, as some have repeatedly claimed.
But the question is this enough? Joining me to discuss this breathtaking transformation sweeping the Arab world are Professor Rashid Khalidi. You're a professor of modern Arab studies at Columbia University and author of Sowing Crisis, the Cold War and American Dominance in the Middle East. Clovis Maqsood, You're a professor of international relations and director of the Center of the Global South at the American University in Washington, D.C., former chief representative of the League of Arab States to the United States and the United Nations, author of numerous books, including The Crisis of the Arab Left. Samer Shahata, you're a professor of Arab politics at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University, author of Shop Floor Culture and Politics in Egypt. Gentlemen, welcome to Empire. I'm going to start with you, Ambassador Maqsood. It's been 6 weeks since Bouaziz set himself on fire. An event and 6 weeks that shook the world, but will they transform the region?
What we have is Arab unity and Arab fragmentation. Arab fragmentation on the top and Arab unity on the bottom. So what happened in Tunisia more or less expedited the transformative factor and the breakthrough in Egypt.
So you think there is no turning back?
I don't think it's irreversible.
Professor Khalidi, put this for us in a historical perspective. The Arab world has been in stagnation now for 3 decades. Since Ben Ali took over in 1987, before him Ali Abdel Salah in 1978, this region has seen no change, certainly not in Egypt. How do you see this transformation in historical perspective?
I think what we're seeing now is a breakup, somewhat similar to what happened immediately after World War I, when you had Woodrow Wilson, the idea of self-determination, and suddenly all over the Arab world there were revolts, there were uprisings, which had the same kind of demands for liberal constitutional forms, an end to external control, greater social justice. Even with a repressive police state, such as has been in place in Egypt for decades, Egypt has a sort of cultural radiance, and when Egypt shakes, as it's shaking now, the entire Arab world feels it. Egypt is the most important country in the Arab world. It's the biggest, it's the intellectual center, it's the media center.
Samer, we've seen that succeed already in Tunisia. It looks like the Mubarak regime is imploding. Are you optimistic about change in Egypt?
Yes, certainly, and sometimes no. But I think that the point of the transformation is certainly already occurring. There's no question about that. Whether the regime continues in one form or another for a week, for a month, until the elections in 2011, or even longer, there's certainly been a transformation in Egypt, and it's been a radical one. We have not seen, and correct me if I'm wrong, this number of protesters all across the country in Egypt protesting